A man died in 1872 and almost nobody noticed. Yet this forgotten philosopher had done something extraordinary. He'd taken God apart piece by piece and shown that everything divine was actually human. The implications were so radical that Karl Marx would later build an entire revolution on his ideas. But here's what makes Ludwig Feuerbach's story almost unbearably ironic. The man who explained religion as humanity worshipping its own reflection spent his final years broke, ignored, and dependent on charity. This is the story of how a brilliant mind dismantled the sacred and paid for it with everything. July 28th, 1804, Landshut, Bavaria. The Feuerbach household wasn't ordinary by any measure. Paul Johann Anselm Ritter von Feuerbach, Ludwig's father, was rewriting Bavarian criminal law at Napoleon's request. He was a legal reformer whose work on criminology would outlast him by centuries. The family called him Vesuvius, not as a compliment. Anselm's temper was legendary, his tyranny over the household absolute. 5 sons grew up in this pressure cooker of intellectual ambition and paternal rage. Every single one achieved distinction. Joseph became an archaeologist. Karl, a mathematician so talented, he created geometric theorems still taught today. Friedrich pursued philology. And Ludwig would become the one who questioned everything their father's generation had built. The household atmosphere was suffocating and stimulating in equal measure. Books everywhere. Conversations about law, philosophy, reform. Anselm expected greatness from his sons, demanded it through force of personality and occasional force of hand. This was enlightened Bavaria, where education mattered intensely and intellectual achievement was the path to significance. But enlightenment came with rigidity. Question the wrong things, and doors slammed shut. Ludwig absorbed this contradiction early. Think deeply, but within acceptable boundaries. At 16, something unexpected happened. Ludwig showed an intense religious tendency. He began studying Hebrew with the son of a local rabbi, diving into sacred texts with the fervour of someone seeking answers to questions he couldn't yet articulate. His father watched this development with concern. Anselm was no religious enthusiast. He wanted Ludwig to study law, to follow the family tradition of legal reform and rational progress. But Ludwig had already departed on a different trajectory. In 1823, Ludwig enrolled at the University of Heidelberg to study Protestant theology. His father reluctantly agreed, perhaps hoping exposure to academic theology would cure his son's religious fervour through contact with its dry, rationalistic presentation. The plan backfired spectacularly. At Heidelberg, Ludwig encountered 2 professors who had set him on a collision course with everything he'd been raised to accept. H.E.G. Paulus lectured on rationalist theology, attempting to explain away the supernatural elements of Christianity through natural causes and historical criticism. Ludwig found these lectures hollow, empty exercises that drained religion of meaning without replacing it with anything substantial. But Karl Daub taught something different. Daub presented theology through the lens of Hegelian philosophy, treating religious doctrines as expressions of deeper philosophical truths. This speculative approach fascinated Ludwig. Here was someone taking religion seriously as a system of thought while simultaneously transforming it into something beyond mere doctrine. The attraction to Hegelian thought created an immediate problem. Ludwig believed in a personal God, a deity who cared about individuals and intervened in the world. But Hegel's philosophy operated through pure reason, through Vernunft, treating God as absolute spirit working through history rather than as a personal being concerned with individual souls. How could these 2 conceptions be reconciled? The tension gnawed at Ludwig. Daub, recognizing his student's intellectual crisis, made a suggestion that would change everything. Go to Berlin and study with Hegel himself. By 1824, Ludwig had worn down his father's resistance. Officially, He was transferring to Berlin to study with the theologians Friedrich Schleiermacher and August Neander. Actually, he was going for Hegel, but even this transfer was complicated. Ludwig's matriculation at Berlin was delayed because authorities suspected him of involvement in the Burschenschaft movement, the politically subversive student fraternities that were organizing resistance to the reactionary German states. Two of Ludwig's brothers were active in these organizations. Karl, the mathematician, had been imprisoned for his involvement and subsequently attempted suicide in despair. The political climate was darkening. Ideas were becoming dangerous. When Ludwig finally arrived in Berlin in 1825, he made a decision that confirmed his father's worst fears. He transferred from the theological faculty to philosophy. For the next 2 years, he attended every lecture Hegel gave. Every single one. The experience was intoxicating. Hegel didn't just teach philosophy, he presented a complete system for understanding reality. History, politics, religion, art, science, everything fit into a grand dialectical progression, where spirit came to know itself through humanity's collective intellectual development. Hegel's Berlin lectures were performances, dense and demanding, requiring total concentration. The lecture hall would fill with students and intellectuals, everyone straining to follow the master's thought as he worked through the systematic unfolding of the absolute. Ludwig was mesmerized. Here was philosophy as total explanation, a framework that could make sense of everything. The appeal was obvious to someone who'd grown up in a household dominated by systematic legal thinking. But there was something more. Hegel offered a way to be deeply serious about religion and philosophy simultaneously, to treat sacred matters with intellectual rigor without reducing them to empty rationalism. Financial difficulties forced Ludwig to leave Berlin after a year. He transferred to the University of Erlangen, where he continued his philosophical studies, while also attending lectures in physiology and anatomy. This scientific education would later prove crucial to his materialist philosophy, giving him a grounding in natural science that most philosophers lacked. In 1828, he completed his doctoral dissertation, De Ratione Una, Universali Infinita, the one, universal, and infinite reason. The title alone announced his continuing commitment to Hegelian idealism, treating reason as a synthesizing universal force. From 1829 to 1835, Feuerbach worked as a docent at Erlangen, lecturing on the history of modern philosophy. He seemed destined for a conventional academic career. His lectures were well received. His philosophical credentials were solid. He was establishing himself as a promising young scholar in the Hegelian tradition. Then in 1830, he destroyed his future with a single, anonymous book, Gedanken über Tod und Unsterblichkeit, Thoughts on Death and Immortality. The title was innocuous enough. The content was explosive. Feuerbach attacked the concept of personal immortality with savage precision, arguing that individual consciousness doesn't survive death. Instead, human qualities are reabsorbed into nature, a kind of impersonal immortality through dissolution rather than the preservation of individual identity. But the real offence was his attack on theology in service of the state, his exposure of how religious doctrines were being used to maintain political control. This was dangerous. Germany in 1830 was in the grip of reactionary politics. The failed revolutions and student movements of previous years had produced a crackdown on dissent. Criticizing established religion meant criticizing the political order that religion supported. Feuerbach knew the risks. That's why he published anonymously. But anonymous publication in a small intellectual community was a temporary shield at best. Within months, his authorship was discovered. The consequences were immediate and permanent. No university would hire him. No academic press would publish his work. At age 26, Ludwig Feuerbach's conventional scholarly career was finished before it properly began. His father's disappointment must have been crushing. All that potential, all that education thrown away for a book attacking immortality, but something else was beginning. Barred from the academy, Feuerbach would develop his ideas outside institutional constraints. The exile was professional death and intellectual liberation simultaneously. During these difficult years, he met Bertha Löw. She was part owner of her family's porcelain factory in Bruckberg, a small town in rural Bavaria. They married in 1837, and Ludwig moved to Bruckberg, supported by Bertha's share of the factory income. For the next 2 decades, he would live in rustic isolation, writing some of the most radical philosophy of the 19th century from a small town most people had never heard of. The isolation was both geographical and intellectual. Feuerbach contributed to the Hallische Jahrbücher für Deutsche Wissenschaft und Kunst, the principal journal of the young Hegelians, connecting him to a network of radical intellectuals using Hegel's method to critique religion and politics. But he avoided political activity. He attended no meetings, joined no movements. Except for a brief appearance at the Frankfurt Assembly during the 1848 revolutions, he lived in studious seclusion. This wasn't timidity. It was a deliberate choice to focus on intellectual work rather than political organizing. From this rural exile, Feuerbach produced a series of major works on the history of philosophy. In 1833, he published his History of Modern Philosophy, from Bacon to Spinoza. In 1837, a volume on Leibniz. In 1838, one on Pierre Bayle. These weren't dry academic histories. They were philosophical excavations, searching for the moments when Western thought had begun to move beyond traditional religious frameworks. Spinoza fascinated him particularly. Here was a philosopher who'd been excommunicated by his own Jewish community for identifying God with nature, for arguing that there was only one substance, and it was simultaneously divine and material. Leibniz interested him for different reasons. The attempt to reconcile mechanism with purpose, to find room for meaning in a world of causes and effects. And Bayle, the skeptical encyclopedist of the Enlightenment, demonstrated how relentless, critical questioning could undermine religious certainties. These historical studies were building towards something. Feuerbach was tracing a lineage of thinkers who had begun dissolving the separation between God and nature, between the sacred and the human. In their work, he found anticipations of his own project, but he was going further than any of them had dared. He was preparing to argue that God wasn't just connected to humanity or expressed through humanity. God was humanity, misunderstood and projected outward. In 1839, he published Zur Kritik der Hegelschen Philosophie, Critique of Hegelian Philosophy. This marked his open break with the philosophical system that had shaped his education. Feuerbach's critique was precise and devastating. Hegel had inverted reality, treating abstract spirit as the true subject and material existence as merely its manifestation. But this was theology in disguise, Feuerbach argued. It was the same old error dressed in philosophical sophistication. The true relationship was the opposite. Concrete, sensuous human beings were the real subject. Ideas were their predicates, their characteristics and productions. Philosophy had to start from actual human existence, from bodies and needs and sensations, not from abstract concepts. This methodological inversion would become known as the transformative method. Where you saw God creating humanity, look again, and you'd see humanity creating God. Where you saw spirit manifesting in matter, look again, and you'd see matter producing consciousness. Feuerbach wasn't abandoning dialectical thinking. He was redirecting it. Hegel's method was powerful, but it had been aimed at the wrong target. Turn it toward concrete human existence, and revolutionary insights became possible. This critique would resonate powerfully with a young journalist named Karl Marx, who was beginning his own struggle with Hegelian philosophy. But that influence lay ahead. For now, Feuerbach was working in isolation, preparing his masterwork. The stage was set for what would become his most famous book, the work that would make him briefly the most discussed philosopher in Germany, and give Marx and Engels the theoretical foundation for their revolutionary politics. In Bruckberg, surrounded by porcelain moulds and rural quiet, Ludwig Feuerbach was about to explain where God really came from. The Essence of Christianity appeared in 1841. The title sounds dry, almost academic. The content was explosive. Feuerbach's central claim was simple enough to state but devastating in its implications. God doesn't create humanity. Humanity creates God. Every attribute we assign to the divine, infinite wisdom, unlimited love, perfect justice. These aren't discoveries about a supernatural being. They're projections. We take our own best qualities, strip away their limitations, and project them onto an imaginary being we then worship. When you say God is love, you're really describing humanity's capacity for love, perfected and externalized. When you claim God is all-knowing, you're taking human reason and removing its boundaries. The divine is human nature, viewed through a distorting mirror that removes all constraints. This wasn't just atheism. Plenty of philosophers had denied God's existence. Feuerbach was doing something more radical. He was explaining where the idea came from in the first place. Religion, he argued, is a form of self-alienation. We create an ideal image of ourselves, project it outward, and then bow down before our own creation. We give to God what rightfully belongs to humanity. Our capacity for infinite love becomes God's infinite love. Our striving for perfect justice becomes God's perfect justice. Our desire for immortality becomes God's eternal nature. The mechanism is projection. The result is alienation. We've separated ourselves from our own best qualities and attributed them to something external. Think about prayer. What are you really doing when you pray? You're addressing your own idealized nature, your own hopes and aspirations, as if they existed independently. You're having a conversation with yourself, mediated through an imaginary being. Feuerbach walks through Christian theology systematically, decoding each doctrine. The Trinity, that's human consciousness understanding itself through three aspects: reason, will, and love. The Incarnation, that's humanity recognizing that the divine is actually human, that God had to become man because God was man all along. The Resurrection, that's our refusal to accept mortality, projected into a story about defeating death. Every theological concept, when properly understood, reveals itself as anthropology. The study of God is really the study of humanity in disguise. This creates a strange situation. Religion is simultaneously false and true. False because God doesn't actually exist as an independent being. True because religious ideas express genuine human qualities and aspirations. Christianity is wrong about the supernatural, but right about human nature. The consequences of this argument were radical. If God is just projected humanity, then we've been worshipping ourselves without knowing it. All the devotion, all the sacrifice, all the energy poured into religion, it's been directed at the wrong target. What we should be doing is recognizing these qualities as our own. Instead of praising God's love, we should cultivate human love. Instead of relying on divine justice, we should create human justice. Instead of hoping for heavenly immortality, we should focus on earthly life. Feuerbach called this the transformation of theology into anthropology. Every statement about God should be converted into a statement about humanity. God is love becomes love is divine. God is infinite becomes human nature has infinite potential. The method he employed came to be called the transformative method. Take any religious claim, identify the subject and predicate. Now reverse them. The predicate is the real subject. The supposed subject is actually a projection of the predicate. Traditional theology says God loves humanity. Feuerbach transforms this. Humanity's capacity for love is what we call divine. Traditional theology says, God created man in his image. Feuerbach transforms this. Man created God in his image. This wasn't just clever wordplay, it was a fundamental reorientation of philosophy. Instead of starting from abstract concepts and moving to concrete reality, start from concrete reality and show how abstractions arise from it. Hegel had argued that spirit manifests itself in the material world. Feuerbach inverted this. Material, human beings produce spiritual concepts. The transformation was complete. The book's style matched its revolutionary content. Feuerbach wrote with passion and clarity, avoiding the dense technical language of academic philosophy. He wanted to be understood. He wanted to change how people thought, not just how philosophers argued. And it worked. The essence of Christianity became a sensation, at least among intellectuals. Here was philosophy that mattered, that addressed the deepest questions about meaning and purpose, that offered liberation from religious authority. Young Hegelians were electrified. They'd been using Hegelian dialectics to critique religious and political orthodoxy, but they'd been doing it piecemeal, attacking this or that specific doctrine. Feuerbach gave them a comprehensive framework. He showed them how to dismantle theology entirely, root and branch. Two of those young radicals were particularly influenced, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They would take Feuerbach's insights and push them in directions he never anticipated. But that's getting ahead of the story. In 1841, Feuerbach was at the peak of his influence. The book established him as the leading philosophical radical in Germany. His analysis seemed to have solved the riddle of religion, to have finally explained why humanity had been trapped in theological thinking for millennia. The argument had gaps, though. Careful readers noticed them immediately. If religion is just projection, why is it so powerful? Why do people continue believing even when the projection is explained? Feuerbach had described the mechanism, but hadn't fully accounted for its persistence. And there was something else. The book focused almost entirely on Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity. Was the same analysis supposed to apply to other religions? To Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism? Feuerbach gestured toward universality, but hadn't demonstrated it. More problematic was the concept of species essence. Feuerbach argued that religion projects humanity's essential nature, its species being. But what exactly was this essence? He described it as the capacity for reason, love, and will. But this seemed abstract, almost as abstract as the Hegelian concepts he was criticizing. Where did this species essence exist? Not in any individual person, who was always limited and imperfect. It existed in humanity as a whole, as a universal. But wasn't this just another abstraction? Wasn't Feuerbach replacing God with humanity and calling it materialism? Critics pounced on this contradiction. How could someone claiming to ground philosophy in concrete existence rely on such an abstract concept? If individuals were the only reality, then species essence was just another projection. Feuerbach struggled with this problem in his later work. He tried to ground species essence in actual social relationships, in the bonds between individuals, but he never quite solved it satisfactorily. There was also the question of what came next. Okay, you've explained that God is a projection. You've decoded theology into anthropology. Now what? How should people live? What should replace religion? Feuerbach's answer was vague. Love humanity instead of God. Recognize your connection to the species. Focus on this world instead of the next. These were fine sentiments, but hardly a practical program. He seemed to think that simply understanding the truth would be enough. Once people realized God was a projection, they'd naturally redirect their devotion to humanity. Religion would wither away as knowledge spread. This was naive. It underestimated religion's social and psychological functions. People didn't believe in God primarily because of philosophical arguments. They believed because religion provided comfort, community, meaning, moral guidance. Showing that the theology was false didn't address these needs. Marx would later criticize this aspect of Feuerbach's thought sharply. Understanding that religion is a projection doesn't eliminate it. You have to change the conditions that make projection necessary in the first place. You have to transform society. But in 1841, these critiques lay in the future. For now, The Essence of Christianity stood as a monumental achievement, a book that seemed to have fundamentally reoriented philosophy away from theology and toward anthropology. The reaction was intense and divided. Religious authorities were predictably hostile. This was atheism of the most dangerous kind, they argued, because it claimed to understand religion better than believers did. It was seductive precisely because it acknowledged religion's truth while denying its object. Liberal intellectuals were fascinated. Here was a way to take religious ideas seriously without accepting religious authority. You could preserve what was valuable in Christianity, its emphasis on love, its concern for the poor, its universalist ethics, while discarding the supernatural framework. Radicals saw revolutionary potential. If God was just projected humanity, then human beings were responsible for their own fate. No divine authority justified existing social hierarchies. No heavenly reward compensated for earthly suffering. Everything depended on what humans did for themselves. The book marked a turning point not just in Feuerbach's career, but in the history of German philosophy. Engels would later write that its publication symbolically ended the era of classical German idealism that had begun with Kant's critique of pure reason 60 years earlier. That might be overstating things. Philosophy doesn't have clean breaks, but the essence of Christianity did represent a decisive shift toward materialism, toward grounding philosophy in concrete human existence rather than abstract concepts. Feuerbach followed up quickly. In 1842, he published his preliminary theses on the reform of philosophy, a series of short, sharp statements outlining his new philosophical approach. Philosophy must begin with the finite, the particular, the determinate. It must start from sensation, from embodied experience, from actual human beings. In 1843 came Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, expanding these themes. Traditional philosophy had been the ally of theology, Feuerbach argued. It had shared theology's basic move, abstracting from concrete existence to reach supposed higher truths. The new philosophy must reverse this. It must show how all abstractions emerge from material reality. The influence on Marx was immediate and profound. Marx was working through his own break with Hegelian idealism at exactly this moment. Feuerbach's work gave him crucial tools: the transformative method, the concept of alienation, the insistence on starting from concrete human existence. In 1844, Marx would write to Feuerbach directly, saying that his books had given socialism a philosophical foundation. Whether Feuerbach intended this or not, his anthropological materialism implied political conclusions. If humanity creates its own essence through its activity, then transforming society means transforming human nature itself. But Marx was already moving beyond Feuerbach even as he acknowledged the debt. The problem with Feuerbach's materialism, Marx was beginning to realize, was that it remained too contemplative. It understood human beings as observers, as sensuous beings receiving impressions from the world. It didn't grasp human activity as practical, as transformative. This critique would crystallize in 1845 when Marx wrote his famous theses on Feuerbach. But we're still in 1841, and Feuerbach's star was rising. He'd produced the philosophical bombshell of the decade. The question was what would come next. What came next was something nobody expected. Fame without fortune, influence without position, a voice that shaped the future while its owner lived in increasing isolation. Feuerbach was now the philosophical celebrity of young Germany. Students read him, intellectuals debated him, his ideas circulated in journals and discussion groups across German-speaking Europe. He'd achieved exactly what every philosopher dreams of: genuine cultural impact, and he hated almost everything about it. The attention made him uncomfortable. The radical students who treated him as their hero didn't understand that he'd never wanted to be anyone's leader. He'd written the essence of Christianity to solve a philosophical problem, not to start a movement. The political implications that others found so exciting were, to him, secondary consequences of his argument about religion and human nature. But try telling that to a generation of young intellectuals who were convinced they'd found the intellectual foundation for transforming society. Marx was different. When Marx engaged with Feuerbach's work, he did so as a serious thinker, wrestling with serious ideas. The two men began corresponding in 1843. Marx was 25, still finding his way philosophically. Feuerbach was 39, at the height of his powers. Marx's letters reveal genuine reverence. He called Feuerbach's Principles of the Philosophy of the Future a work of genius. He told Feuerbach that whether intentionally or not, he'd given socialism its philosophical foundation. High praise from a young man who would eventually eclipse his teacher's fame entirely. Feuerbach responded with warmth, but also distance. He appreciated Marx's intelligence. He recognized that this brilliant young radical understood his work better than most. But Marx's enthusiasm for political revolution made him nervous. Philosophy was one thing, overturning society was another. This tension would define their relationship. Marx wanted to push Feuerbach's insights toward revolutionary conclusions. If religion was alienation, then ending alienation required changing the material conditions that produced it. Philosophy alone couldn't do that. You needed political action, social transformation, the reorganization of economic life. Feuerbach resisted. His method was critique, not revolution. He wanted to clarify thinking, not storm barricades. The transformation he envisioned was intellectual and cultural, not political. Change how people understand themselves, and society would follow. Eventually, gradually, without violence, the difference between these positions would become crucial. But in 1843, they were still allies. Marx was absorbing Feuerbach's method, using it to develop his own critique of Hegelian philosophy. The famous inversion, standing Hegel on his head, as Engels later put it, came directly from Feuerbach's transformative method. Where Hegel had spirit creating material reality, Marx would place material production, creating consciousness. Where Hegel had history as the self-realization of absolute idea, Marx would show class struggle and economic development. The structure of the argument, the dialectical movement, even much of the vocabulary, all inherited from Hegel through Feuerbach's materialist inversion. Yet Marx was already seeing limitations. Feuerbach's materialism was contemplative. It treated human beings as observers, as creatures who received sensations and formed ideas. It understood the world as something to be interpreted, not changed. This was the problem Marx would eventually identify in his theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. But that critique came later. In 1843, the relationship was productive and mutually respectful. Feuerbach published his Principles of the Philosophy of the Future that year. It was meant to be the positive statement of his new philosophy after years of critique. Where his earlier works had torn down Hegelian idealism and Christian theology, the Principles would build something new. The book is structured as a series of short theses, 66 numbered statements that outline Feuerbach's philosophical position. It's deliberately different in form from traditional philosophical treatises. No systematic argument building to grand conclusions, just clear statements of principle. The new philosophy begins with the human being, not with God or absolute spirit. It starts from sensuous existence, from the body, from the concrete experience of living in the world. Thought emerges from this material foundation, not the reverse. Philosophy must become anthropology. The question isn't what is being as such, but what is the human being? Every metaphysical question resolves into a question about human nature and human needs. The senses aren't passive receivers of data. They're active, culturally shaped, historically developed. The eye that appreciates beauty is a different organ than the crude eye that merely sees. Human sensibility is created through history, through art, through culture. The individual human being isn't the fundamental unit. What's fundamental is the relationship between I and thou, the dialogue between persons. Human nature is essentially social. We become fully human only in relation to others. These principles sound simple, almost obvious now, but in the context of German idealism, with its emphasis on abstract thought and universal spirit, they were revolutionary. Feuerbach was insisting that philosophy return to earth, to bodies, to actual human existence. The book was well received in radical circles. Here was the manifesto of the new materialism, the alternative to Hegelian abstraction. Students copied out favourite passages. Discussion groups debated its implications. But the principles had a problem. They were programmatic, not systematic. They announced what philosophy should become without fully working out the details. Feuerbach had sketched a new approach without developing it into a complete philosophical system. He never would. The rest of his career would be spent elaborating these themes, applying them to specific topics, but never creating the comprehensive system that might have rivaled Hegel's achievements. Why not? Partly temperament. Feuerbach wasn't a system builder. He was a critic, an essayist, someone who worked through problems in specific contexts rather than constructing grand architectures of thought. But partly circumstances. He was still living in rural isolation, still barred from university positions, still dependent on his wife's declining income from the porcelain factory. He didn't have the institutional support, or the research assistance, or the daily intellectual exchange that might have pushed him toward more systematic work. What he did have was an audience. The principles made him the theoretical leader of the young Hegelians, that loose network of radical intellectuals using Hegelian methods to critique religion and politics. Bruno Bauer was attacking biblical scholarship, showing the Gospels as human documents rather than divine revelation. David Friedrich Strauss had published his controversial Life of Jesus, treating the supernatural elements as myth. Max Stirner would soon write The Ego and Its Own, pushing individualism to anarchist extremes. Feuerbach was the senior figure in this constellation, the one who'd most thoroughly worked out the philosophical basis for their shared critique of religion and idealism. But he wasn't comfortable with the role. He contributed to the young Hegelian journals, but kept his distance from Berlin, where most of them gathered. He avoided their meetings, their intrigues, their endless debates about tactics and strategy. He preferred his books and his solitude. In 1845, something happened that would eventually change everything, though its significance wasn't immediately obvious. Karl Marx, now living in Brussels, after being expelled from Paris, sat down and wrote 11 short theses about Feuerbach's philosophy. He didn't publish them. They were notes for his own clarification, a way of thinking through where Feuerbach's materialism succeeded and where it failed. They wouldn't appear in print until Engels published them decades later as an appendix to his own book on Feuerbach. But those 11 theses contained Marx's definitive break with Feuerbach's approach. The chief defect of all previous materialism, Marx wrote, is that it conceives of reality only as object, only as something to be observed. It doesn't grasp human activity as practical, as transformative. It doesn't understand that we change the world through our labour. Feuerbach dissolves the religious essence into the human essence, but the human essence isn't something abstract inherent in each individual. It's the ensemble of social relations. You can't understand human nature apart from the specific historical and social conditions that produce it. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. These criticisms were devastating because they were largely correct. Feuerbach's materialism did remain contemplative. He did tend to treat human nature as a fixed essence rather than as historically created through practice. He did focus on interpretation rather than transformation. But Marx's critique also missed something important. Feuerbach wasn't trying to do what Marx wanted him to do. He wasn't attempting to create a revolutionary political philosophy. He was working out a naturalistic account of religion and consciousness. The fact that he succeeded at his own project while failing at a different project Marx wanted doesn't necessarily diminish the achievement. Still, the theses marked the point where Marx moved decisively beyond Feuerbach. He'd absorbed the method, learned from the critique of alienation, taken what he needed. Now he was developing his own approach, one that would eventually culminate in Capital and the mature theory of historical materialism. Feuerbach never read those theses. He didn't know Marx had broken with his approach. They continued corresponding, though less frequently. Marx still respected Feuerbach's earlier work, even as his own thinking evolved in different directions. Meanwhile, Feuerbach was developing his own ideas further. In 1846, he published The Essence of Religion, which marked a shift in his thinking, where the essence of Christianity had focused on the projection of human qualities onto God. This new work examined religion's relationship to nature. Religion doesn't arise only from self-alienation, Feuerbach now argued. It emerges from humanity's encounter with external nature, with forces beyond our control. The feeling of absolute dependence on nature produces religious consciousness. This was a more sophisticated account than his earlier work. It recognized that religion has objective as well as subjective roots. It's not just about projecting our own essence. It's about confronting our limits, our vulnerability, our dependence on forces we don't control. The drive to happiness meets obstacles. Nature threatens us. Death awaits everyone. These realities produce religious feeling, the wish for protection, for meaning, for transcendence over our finitude. Feuerbach was moving toward what scholars call his bipolar model of religion. Religion emerges from the interaction between subjective human needs and objective natural forces. It's not purely projection, not purely response to nature, but the product of their encounter. This evolution in his thinking showed increasing sophistication, but it also moved him further from the clear, sharp position that had made the essence of Christianity so influential. The argument was more nuanced, more complex, harder to summarize in revolutionary slogans. And that mattered because the political situation was changing rapidly. By 1848, revolution was in the air across Europe. The continent was experiencing economic crisis, political unrest, demands for constitutional reform, and national liberation. February saw revolution in France. March brought uprisings in the German states, in Austria, in Italy. The young Hegelians and their allies suddenly found themselves at the center of political events. This was the moment they'd been theorizing about, the opportunity to transform society, to realize philosophy in practice. Feuerbach watched from Bruckberg with mixed feelings. He supported reform, even revolution, in principle. The old order needed to change. Autocratic monarchy was incompatible with human dignity. People deserved political freedom, economic justice, rational government. But he distrusted the revolutionaries' enthusiasm. He feared violence. He doubted that political change alone could create the cultural transformation he believed necessary. When students and radical intellectuals invited him to deliver public lectures at Heidelberg, he accepted. This was his chance to speak directly to the revolutionary generation, to shape the intellectual climate of the moment. The lectures ran from December 1848 to March 1849, twice weekly, at the Heidelberg City Hall. They drew enormous crowds. Students, workers, intellectuals, curious citizens packed the hall to hear the famous philosopher who'd explained religion as human self-alienation. Feuerbach spoke about religion, about human nature, about the relationship between material conditions and consciousness. He talked about food. Man is what he eats, he said, borrowing from the physiologist Jacob Mollschott. If you want to improve people's thinking, improve their nutrition. Give them better food instead of sermons against sin. It sounds trivial until you realize the implications. Consciousness depends on material conditions. Thought emerges from bodily existence. You can't separate spiritual development from physical welfare. The lectures were popular, but also disappointing to the revolutionaries. They'd wanted fire, calls to action, philosophical justification for radical politics. What they got was careful analysis of religion's anthropological foundations and discussions of physiology. Feuerbach remained the philosopher, not the revolutionary. He'd give them theory but not tactics, understanding but not marching orders. By spring 1849, the revolutionary moment was passing. The Frankfurt Assembly had failed to create a unified German nation. Conservative forces were reasserting control. The brief window when radical transformation seemed possible was closing. Feuerbach returned to Bruckberg. The lectures had been exhausting. He was 44 years old and in declining health. The brief moment of public engagement had cost him considerably, and the world was moving past him faster than he realized. The 1850s arrived with crushing silence. No more invitations to lecture. No more eager students seeking his guidance. The intellectual current that had briefly made Feuerbach famous was flowing elsewhere, toward younger thinkers with sharper political instincts. Karl Marx was among them. He'd devoured the essence of Christianity when it appeared in 1841. It liberated him, gave him tools to critique religion and idealism together. But Marx wasn't satisfied with critique alone. He wanted transformation, revolutionary action that would remake society from its economic foundations upward. In 1845, Marx scribbled 11 brief notes in a private notebook. He never published them. They sat in his papers for decades, discovered only after his death. Engels would eventually publish them as the theses on Feuerbach. They're cryptic, fragmentary, sometimes obscure, but they mark the decisive break between Feuerbach's contemplative materialism and Marx's revolutionary philosophy. The chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, Marx wrote in the first thesis, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. What does that mean? Marx is saying Feuerbach understands the material world as something humans observe and think about, but he misses the crucial point. Humans don't just contemplate reality. They actively transform it through labour, through social practice. The 11th thesis is the famous one. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. That single sentence captures why Marx moved beyond Feuerbach. Philosophy, as interpretation, wasn't enough. Understanding religion as projection, grasping the material basis of thought, analysing human nature, all valuable, but insufficient. The task was revolution, concrete transformation of social relations. Feuerbach had given Marx the materialist foundation, but Feuerbach's materialism remained abstract, focused on the generic human being rather than actual humans embedded in specific economic and social structures. Marx would spend the rest of his life developing historical materialism, analysing capitalism, organising workers. Feuerbach had opened a door Marx walked through and never looked back. Did Feuerbach know about these theses? No, they stayed private, but he would have recognised the criticism even without reading Marx's notes. By the early 1850s, the Younger radicals were already treating him as yesterday's philosopher. Respected, influential in his time, but now surpassed by more radical thinkers who understood that material conditions meant economic structures, class conflict, modes of production. Feuerbach kept writing. In 1851, he published lectures on the essence of religion, based on his Heidelberg talks. The book expanded his bipolar model. Religion arises from humanity's dependence on nature, from the drive for happiness confronting the reality of death and suffering. It's more complex than the essence of Christianity's projection theory, more nuanced about religion's multiple sources, but complexity doesn't make revolutions. The 1851 lectures were admired by specialists, ignored by the wider public. Feuerbach's moment had passed. Meanwhile, his personal life was unravelling. The porcelain factory that had supported him for 20 years was struggling. Competition, changing markets, poor management. Bertha tried to keep it afloat. Feuerbach helped when he could, but he knew nothing about manufacturing or business. His contribution had been living cheaply and not complaining about isolation. In 1860, the factory went bankrupt. Everything collapsed at once. The income stopped. The house in Bruckberg belonged to the factory, so they had to leave. Feuerbach was 56 years old, in declining health, with no savings and no prospects for employment. They moved to Reichenberg, near Nuremberg, into modest lodgings. Feuerbach's friends organised financial support, small donations from admirers who remembered the essence of Christianity. It was charity, barely disguised. The philosopher who'd explained religion as humanity worshipping its own projected essence now depended on handouts from former readers. The irony wasn't lost on him. But what choice did he have? He couldn't return to academia. His reputation as an atheist and radical made that impossible. He couldn't support himself through writing. The market for philosophical works had never been large, and his recent books hadn't sold well. So he lived on charity and wrote occasional pieces when his health permitted. The decline was gradual but relentless. Chronic illness, probably respiratory problems, limited his energy. He spent days in bed, unable to work. The man who'd written about sensualism, about the body's centrality to consciousness, experienced his own body's betrayal, yet he stayed intellectually engaged. In 1868, he read Marx's Capital, the massive critique of political economy that Marx had finally published the year before. Feuerbach was impressed. This was what he'd gestured toward but never developed, a systematic analysis of how material conditions shape consciousness, how economic structures create alienation, how capitalism transforms human relations into commodity exchange. Marx had taken Feuerbach's insights and applied them to the real mechanisms of social power. Feuerbach had shown that religion alienates humans from their own essence. Marx demonstrated that capitalism does the same thing through wage labour. Workers produce value but don't control the products of their labour. They're separated from what they create, just as believers are separated from the human qualities they project onto God. Reading Capital must have been bittersweet, vindication and obsolescence simultaneously. Marx had built on Feuerbach's foundation, but constructed something far more comprehensive, far more politically potent. The student had surpassed the teacher not through betrayal, but through development, taking ideas seriously enough to push them beyond their original limits. In 1870, Feuerbach joined the German Social Democratic Party. It was a symbolic gesture, probably his only explicitly political act. He was 66, sick, isolated in Reichenberg. He wasn't going to organise workers or attend party meetings, but joining mattered. It signalled that he understood philosophy's relationship to politics differently now, that contemplative materialism wasn't enough, that changing the world required more than understanding it. The party accepted him gladly. Having Feuerbach's name on their rolls meant something. He was the philosopher who demolished religion's claims to transcendent truth, who'd shown that human liberation required abandoning otherworldly hopes. The Social Democrats were building a movement based on collective human action, on workers taking control of their own fate. Feuerbach's philosophy, however limited Marx found it, still provided ammunition against the religious and idealist justifications for accepting existing social hierarchies. But joining the party couldn't restore his health. The chronic illness worsened. By 1871, he was mostly bedridden. Friends visited when they could. Bertha cared for him. He read, thought, occasionally wrote brief notes. The productive years were over. What remained was waiting. He died on September 13th, 1872, in Reichenberg. He was 68. The obituaries acknowledged his historical importance while treating him as a figure from an earlier era. The essence of Christianity had marked the end of classical German philosophy, they said. Feuerbach belonged to that vanished world of the 1840s, when young Hegelians believed that critiquing religion and philosophy could transform society. The funeral was modest. He was buried at Johannisfriedhof in Nuremberg. No grand monument, no state honours. The philosopher who'd spent his life explaining humanity's earthly nature received an earthly burial, remembered by friends and former readers, but already fading into history. His influence, though, was just beginning its strangest transformations, not through his own works, which would be read mainly by specialists, but through what others made of his ideas. Marx and Engels had moved beyond him, but they'd absorbed crucial elements: the materialist inversion of Hegel, the critique of alienation, the insistence that consciousness depends on material existence. These became foundational for historical materialism, for the entire Marxist tradition that would shape the next century's political conflicts. Nietzsche read Feuerbach and found confirmation for his own critique of Christianity. If God is a human projection, then Christian morality is human morality in disguise, reflecting the psychology of the weak who resent the strong. Nietzsche took Feuerbach's anthropological reduction and pushed it toward genealogy, toward exposing the psychological origins of moral systems. Freud didn't cite Feuerbach directly, but the influence is unmistakable. Religion as wish fulfillment, God as the projection of the father figure, belief arising from psychological needs rather than rational evidence. These are Feuerbachian themes translated into psychoanalytic language. Freud's Future of an Illusion reads like the essence of Christianity rewritten with the unconscious replacing species essence. 20th century existentialists found something valuable too. Feuerbach's emphasis on finitude, on death as the horizon that shapes human consciousness, anticipated existential philosophy's central concerns. His insistence that philosophy starts with concrete, sensuous human beings rather than abstract essences resonated with phenomenology's focus on lived experience. Each of these traditions took pieces of Feuerbach, incorporated them into larger projects, and left the rest behind. Nobody became a Feuerbachian the way people became Marxists or Freudians or existentialists. His philosophy was too incomplete, too tied to the specific controversies of 1840s Germany. But his influence spread through these indirect channels, shaping modern thought in ways rarely acknowledged. The critique of religion he pioneered became standard in secular intellectual circles. The idea that religious beliefs require sociological and psychological explanation rather than theological justification, that we should ask what human needs religion fulfills rather than whether its claims are true. This is Feuerbach's legacy, even when his name isn't mentioned. His methodological innovation, the transformative method of inverting subject and predicate, became a tool used across disciplines. Wherever someone argues that what appears as cause is actually effect, that what seems primary is derivative, they're employing Feuerbach's approach. Marx inverted the relationship between ideas and material conditions. Nietzsche inverted the relationship between morality and psychology. Freud inverted the relationship between conscious thought and unconscious drives. The specific inversions differ, But the method traces back to Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. What got lost in these appropriations was Feuerbach's positive vision. He didn't just want to critique religion and idealism. He wanted to establish a new philosophy centered on human sensuousness, on the I-thou relationship, on love as the fundamental bond between individuals. This vision never developed fully. The principles of the philosophy of the future sketched it in aphoristic form, but Feuerbach never built the systematic alternative philosophy he promised. Maybe it was impossible. Maybe the critical work was easier than the constructive work, showing that religion is projection doesn't automatically tell you what should replace it, demonstrating that idealism inverts the true relationship between thought and being doesn't automatically generate a complete materialist philosophy. Feuerbach opened questions he couldn't answer, cleared ground he couldn't build on. His life embodied contradictions he couldn't resolve. The radical who feared revolution, the materialist who lived in rural isolation rather than engaging with industrial society, the philosopher of sensuousness who spent decades in abstract theoretical work, the critic of alienation who remained alienated from the political movements inspired by his ideas. These contradictions don't invalidate his contributions. They make him recognizably human, a thinker working through problems that exceeded his ability to solve them completely. His honesty about philosophical difficulties, his willingness to revise earlier positions, his recognition that religion couldn't be dismissed as mere error but had to be understood as a response to real human needs. These showed intellectual integrity even when they complicated his arguments. Assessing Feuerbach requires distinguishing what he accomplished from what he attempted. He accomplished a decisive critique of Hegelian idealism and theological thinking. He demonstrated that religious ideas could be explained naturalistically without assuming divine reality. He developed a materialist philosophy that influenced multiple subsequent traditions. He attempted but didn't complete a positive philosophy of the future, a systematic materialism, a political theory that could guide social transformation. These failures matter, but they don't erase his achievements. Philosophy advances through partial successes, through thinkers who solve some problems while creating new ones for successors to address. Feuerbach solved the problem of how to move beyond Hegel without simply rejecting philosophy. He created new problems about the relationship between theory and practice, between understanding the world and changing it, between individual consciousness and social structure. Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and others addressed these problems in different ways, building on Feuerbach's foundation while moving beyond his limitations. The philosophical landscape Feuerbach left behind was more complex than either his admirers or critics acknowledged. His influence operated on multiple levels simultaneously, creating theoretical resources that different movements appropriated for contradictory purposes. Scientific materialists claimed him as their prophet. Their religious liberals found in his work tools for reforming Christianity from within. Marxists used his concepts while denouncing his philosophical limitations. Each group took what served their agenda and ignored the rest. This selective appropriation began during his lifetime. When The Essence of Christianity appeared in 1841, readers immediately divided over its implications. Some saw it as the final destruction of religious belief, the philosophical equivalent of artillery demolishing church walls. Others interpreted it as a purification of religion, stripping away supernatural elements to reveal Christianity's true humanistic core. Feuerbach himself seemed uncertain which reading he endorsed. His later revisions to the text sometimes supported one interpretation, sometimes the other. The scientific materialists who flourished in mid-19th century Germany found Feuerbach's emphasis on nature and sensuousness perfectly suited to their project. Karl Vogt, Jakob Mollschott, and Ludwig Büchner popularized a crude materialism that reduced all mental phenomena to physical processes. Moleschot's famous slogan, which Feuerbach apparently endorsed, "Man is what he eats," captured this reductionist impulse. If consciousness depends entirely on material conditions, then improving those conditions becomes the path to human elevation. Feuerbach attended Moleschot's lectures in Heidelberg during the revolutionary period of 1848 to 49. The physiologist's arguments linking nutrition to mental capacity impressed him deeply. Here was materialism made practical, transformed from abstract philosophy into concrete social program. Feed people better, and they think better. Change their diet, and you change their consciousness. This seemed to fulfill Feuerbach's own call for a philosophy grounded in sensuousness rather than speculation. But Feuerbach's materialism was never this straightforward. His emphasis on sensuousness wasn't meant to reduce mind to matter mechanically. He insisted that human senses are qualitatively different from animal senses precisely because they're shaped by culture, language, and social relationships. The eye that appreciates beauty isn't simply a biological organ responding to visual stimuli. It's a human eye, cultivated through participation in aesthetic traditions. This distinction mattered philosophically, even if the scientific materialists ignored it. The religious liberals took Feuerbach in a completely different direction. They agreed that traditional theology projected human qualities onto an external deity. Fine, so Christianity needed reform, not abolition. Strip away the supernatural elements, and you're left with ethical teachings about love, compassion, and human solidarity. These teachings remain valuable whether or not God exists. Religion survives as a symbolic expression of human ideals rather than as literal, metaphysical truth. This interpretation domesticated Feuerbach's radical critique. He'd argued that religion was alienation, a pathological displacement of human qualities onto an imaginary being. The liberals translated this into religion is symbolism, a poetic way of expressing moral truths. The difference is enormous. Alienation suggests sickness requiring cure. Symbolism suggests metaphor requiring interpretation. One demands revolution, the other merely reform. George Eliot's English translation of The Essence of Christianity in 1854 facilitated this liberal appropriation. Her version reached audiences who would never read German philosophy, but were hungry for alternatives to orthodox Christianity. Victorian intellectuals struggling with biblical criticism and scientific challenges to faith found in Feuerbach permission to retain Christian ethics while abandoning Christian metaphysics. They could be cultural Christians without being believing Christians. Feuerbach would have rejected this reading. His point wasn't that God is a useful fiction. His point was that projecting human qualities onto God diminishes humanity itself. As long as people attribute their own capacities to an external being, they remain alienated from their true nature. The solution isn't reinterpreting religion symbolically. It's abolishing religion entirely and reclaiming those projected qualities as human achievements. Yet the text itself enabled multiple readings. Feuerbach's rhetorical strategy involved showing how every attribute of God corresponds to some human quality or need. God's infinity reflects humanity's unlimited capacity for thought. God's love mirrors the human capacity for affection. This one-to-one correspondence could be read two ways. Either it proves God is merely human projection, or it reveals that theology has always secretly been anthropology, a disguised form of human self-understanding. The political radicals faced their own interpretive challenges. Marx's famous critique in the Theses on Feuerbach identified the central problem. Feuerbach's materialism was contemplative rather than practical. He explained how religion arose from human nature and social conditions. But he offered no program for transforming those conditions. Understanding alienation isn't enough. You have to change the world that produces alienation. This criticism was devastating, but also somewhat unfair. Feuerbach never claimed to offer a political program. His project was philosophical anthropology, understanding what human beings are and how they relate to their own creations. Demanding that he also provide revolutionary strategy, expects philosophy to do work it wasn't designed for. Still, Marx's critique identified a genuine limitation. Feuerbach treated humanity and species essence as if they were universal, unchanging categories, but actual human beings live in specific historical circumstances, organized into classes with conflicting interests. Abstract humanism that ignores these divisions remains toothless politically. It can critique religion, but can't explain how to overcome the conditions that make religion necessary. The late revisions to Feuerbach's religious theory complicated these debates further. His lectures on the essence of religion, published in 1851, shifted emphasis from consciousness to nature. Religion no longer arose primarily from self-projection. It emerged from humanity's dependence on natural forces beyond our control. We worship gods because we're vulnerable to drought, disease, death. Religion is less about alienating our own qualities than about personifying the powers that determine our fates. This bipolar theory made religion seem less pathological and more inevitable. If religious belief stems from our actual dependence on nature, it can't simply be abolished through philosophical critique. As long as humans remain finite, mortal, and vulnerable to forces they can't control, religious responses will persist. The implications were sobering. Feuerbach had built his reputation on explaining religion away. Now he was suggesting it might be ineradicable. The shift also moved Feuerbach closer to materialism in the conventional sense. Earlier, he'd emphasized consciousness, projection, and self-alienation. These were mental processes, however much they reflected material conditions. Now he stressed external nature as the objective ground of religious belief. Humans don't create gods from their own consciousness alone. They respond to real encounters with natural power that threatens or sustains them. This evolution in his thinking never fully integrated with his earlier work. The essence of Christianity remained his famous text, the one everyone read and argued about. Few people engaged seriously with the lectures on the essence of religion. The later theory complicated his message without replacing it. He ended up with two partially incompatible accounts of religion's origin that he never successfully reconciled. His personal life during these theoretical developments adds another layer of complexity. He lived in rural isolation, supported by his wife's share in a porcelain factory. When the factory went bankrupt in 1860, Feuerbach faced destitution at age 56. He moved to Reichenberg near Nuremberg and spent his final 12 years in declining health, dependent on donations from admirers. The philosopher who'd critiqued alienation experienced profound alienation himself, cut off from intellectual community, unable to support himself through his work. Yet he continued thinking, reading, engaging. In 1868, he read Marx's Capital with enthusiasm, recognizing in it the political economy his own philosophy had lacked. In 1870, he joined the Social Democratic Party, a gesture of solidarity with the workers' movement his ideas had indirectly inspired. These late actions suggest someone still trying to connect theory with practice, philosophy with politics, even as physical and mental capacities declined. He died on September 13th, 1872, largely forgotten by the philosophical establishment. No major obituaries marked his passing. The intellectual world had moved on. Materialism had evolved into more sophisticated forms. Marxism had absorbed his useful concepts while discarding his limitations. New philosophical movements were emerging that would dominate the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Feuerbach seemed like a transitional figure whose moment had passed. This assessment was premature. His influence persisted through channels less obvious than direct citation. Whenever someone argues that ideas reflect material conditions rather than existing independently, they're employing Feuerbach's method. Whenever someone analyzes cultural phenomena as projections of human needs and desires, they're following his approach. Whenever someone insists that philosophy must start from concrete, embodied human existence rather than abstract concepts, they're echoing his materialism. Nietzsche absorbed Feuerbach's critique of Christianity's inversion of values. Where Feuerbach saw religion projecting human qualities onto God, Nietzsche saw it projecting weakness onto strength, sickness onto health, resentment onto noble values. The mechanism was similar, even though Nietzsche's evaluation differed. Feuerbach thought religion alienated humanity from its true nature. Nietzsche thought it expressed a particular type of human nature, the slave morality of the weak. Freud's analysis of religion as wish fulfillment developed Feuerbach's insights psychologically. God as projected father figure, heaven as compensation for earthly suffering, religious belief as defense mechanism against anxiety about death and meaninglessness. These psychoanalytic interpretations translated Feuerbach's philosophical anthropology into psychological terms. The projection theory became a clinical observation about how minds cope with difficult realities. Existentialism's emphasis on embodied situated existence echoed Feuerbach's sensualism. His insistence that philosophy must start from the concrete human being rather than abstract consciousness anticipated existentialist themes. The I-thou relationship he emphasized in later writings influenced Martin Buber's dialogical philosophy. The concern with finitude, mortality, and anxiety about death resonated with existentialist preoccupations. Phenomenology's focus on lived experience rather than abstract categories developed themes Feuerbach had introduced. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of embodiment, his analysis of perception as active engagement with the world rather than passive reception, extended Feuerbach's critique of abstract idealism. The body wasn't merely an object studied scientifically, it was the lived basis of all experience and meaning. These influences operated indirectly, often without acknowledgement. Philosophers absorbed Feuerbach's ideas through Marx, through cultural osmosis, through the general intellectual atmosphere he'd helped create. His specific arguments became less important than the shifts in perspective he'd enabled. After Feuerbach, certain questions became mandatory. How do ideas relate to material conditions? What role does embodiment play in consciousness? How do cultural productions reflect and shape human self-understanding? The decline of Hegelian idealism as the dominant philosophical framework owed much to Feuerbach's critique. You couldn't simply posit spirit or absolute idea as the fundamental reality anymore without addressing his objections. Even philosophers who rejected his materialism had to account for how consciousness relates to concrete existence. Even those who defended religion had to explain projection and alienation rather than simply asserting divine reality. This legacy creates interpretive difficulties. Feuerbach wasn't a systematic thinker in the way Hegel was. He didn't build a complete philosophical system. His works are critical rather than constructive, better at demolishing positions than establishing alternatives. The positive philosophy he promised in the Principles of the Philosophy of the Future remained fragmentary, more program than achievement. Assessing him requires deciding what counts as philosophical success. If success means creating a complete system that answers all questions, he failed. If it means opening new lines of inquiry that others develop further, he succeeded brilliantly. If it means changing how subsequent thinkers frame problems, his influence was enormous. If it means establishing truths that remain unchallenged, his specific claims have all been contested. Perhaps the fairest assessment recognizes him as a philosopher of transition. He helped move German philosophy from idealism toward materialism, from speculation toward empiricism, from theology toward anthropology. These transitions were incomplete, contested, and continue today. but they mark decisive shifts in how we think about consciousness, religion, and human nature. Feuerbach participated in creating these shifts, even though he didn't complete them alone. The contradictions in his position became increasingly apparent, even to sympathetic readers. He claimed to be a materialist, but retained idealist elements in his understanding of human essence. He emphasized sensuousness and embodiment, but his materialism remained contemplative rather than practical. He critiqued religion's alienation, but offered no concrete program for overcoming it beyond philosophical enlightenment. Marx identified these problems with surgical precision. In his 11 Theses on Feuerbach, written in 1845, but not published until after Marx's death, he acknowledged what Feuerbach had achieved while exposing what he'd missed. The first thesis went straight to the core weakness. Feuerbach understood materialism as contemplation, as observation of the object. He failed to grasp human activity itself as objective activity. For Marx, this was the crucial error. Humans don't just perceive the world, they transform it through labour. Consciousness emerges from practice, from doing, from changing material conditions. Feuerbach treated sensuousness as passive reception. Even when he emphasized embodiment and feeling, he conceived it as individuals relating to objects. What he missed was that humans relate to nature through social production. We don't just sense the world, we work on it collectively, creating the very conditions of our sensory experience. The religious essence that Feuerbach analysed wasn't simply projected from some abstract human nature. It arose from specific social relations, from actual conditions of human life that generated alienation and suffering. You couldn't overcome religious alienation through philosophical critique alone. You had to change the social conditions that produced it. This leads to Marx's most famous thesis, the 11th. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This wasn't rejecting philosophy entirely. It was insisting that philosophy must become practical, must connect to revolutionary transformation of social relations. Feuerbach had inverted Hegel, replacing spirit with man, but he left man as an abstraction, a species essence outside history. Real humans exist in specific societies, classes, relations of production. Their consciousness reflects these material conditions, not some timeless human nature. The critique was devastating, but also generous. Marx built on Feuerbach's foundations, even while demolishing his conclusions. The materialist inversion of Hegel remained crucial. The analysis of alienation provided essential tools, but these needed development beyond what Feuerbach had achieved. Feuerbach never directly responded to Marx's theses, which circulated privately among the young Hegelians but weren't published. He may never have read them. Even if he had, his philosophical framework didn't allow addressing Marx's objections. He couldn't accept that philosophy itself needed to become revolutionary practice rather than contemplative understanding. This limitation became clearer during the revolutionary upheavals of 1848. When Europe exploded in democratic revolutions, Feuerbach remained characteristically detached. Students lionized him. Radical intellectuals saw him as their philosophical hero. They invited him to deliver public lectures in Heidelberg during the revolution's height. He accepted, speaking twice weekly from December 1848 through March 1849. The lectures drew enormous crowds. People stood in packed halls to hear the philosopher who dared to declare God a human projection. He attacked religious orthodoxy with the same sharp analysis that had made him famous, but he offered no political program, no call to action, no connection between philosophical critique and revolutionary transformation. The lectures on religion occurred while barricades were being built, while constitutions were being written and rewritten, while the old order fought desperately to maintain itself. Feuerbach spoke about humanity's need to recognize itself rather than worshipping false gods. The revolutionaries wanted to know what this meant for political organization, for economic structures, for the shape of the new society they were trying to create. He couldn't answer those questions. His philosophy provided tools for understanding alienation, but not for overcoming it practically. He could explain why people believed in God, but not how to build a world where such belief became unnecessary. The revolution failed. By 1849, the old regimes had reasserted control. Democratic movements were crushed. Radicals went into exile or prison. The brief moment when philosophical ideas seemed to connect directly to political transformation ended abruptly. Feuerbach withdrew again to Bruckberg, to his rural isolation and philosophical work. The failure of 1848 affected him less than it did the more politically engaged young Hegelians. He'd never invested heavily in revolutionary politics. Philosophy remained his domain, and he continued working within it. His later writings showed evolution, but not fundamental change. The Lectures on the Essence of Religion, published in 1851, developed what he called a bipolar theory. Religion no longer arose solely from projection of species essence. It emerged from humanity's confrontation with nature, from the drive toward happiness, meeting the reality of dependence on forces beyond human control. Nature became the first object of religion. Humans worship what they depend upon. What determines their fate? The gods represent personifications of natural powers that sustain or threaten life. As societies develop, these natural gods become more abstract, more spiritual, but the underlying structure remains. This added sophistication to the original projection theory. Religious belief wasn't just internal self-alienation. It reflected actual human vulnerability, actual dependence on natural and social forces we don't fully control. The critique of religion had to acknowledge this material basis rather than treating belief as pure illusion. The shift marked increased attention to material conditions of human existence. Eating and drinking became, in Feuerbach's striking phrase, religious acts. Man is what he eats. This wasn't crude reductionism, but recognition that physical sustenance, bodily needs, material conditions fundamentally shape consciousness and culture. Jacob Mulshot, the physiologist who attended the Heidelberg lectures, developed these ideas into scientific materialism. The body's chemistry affects thought and emotion. Nutrition influences mental capacity. Material conditions of life determine possibilities for human development. These weren't metaphorical claims, but literal physiological facts. Feuerbach embraced this direction enthusiastically. His sensualism found scientific confirmation in physiological research. The unity of mind and body, spirit and matter, wasn't philosophical speculation, but biological reality. Consciousness emerged from and depended upon physical processes, yet he never developed these insights systematically. His later works remained fragmentary, collections of observations and aphorisms rather than comprehensive theories. The philosophy of the future, announced in 1843, never arrived as a complete system. Financial catastrophe struck in 1860 when Bertha's porcelain factory went bankrupt. After decades of modest security, Feuerbach found himself impoverished at age 56. He and Bertha moved to Reichenberg, near Nuremberg, living on donations from supporters and whatever literary income he could generate. The final 12 years were difficult. Constant illness, financial dependence, isolation from contemporary philosophical developments. He watched German philosophy move in directions he couldn't follow. Neo-Kantianism was rising. Positivism dominated scientific circles. His own influence was fading except through Marx, whose work was taking materialism toward political economy rather than philosophical anthropology. In 1868, he read Marx's Capital with enthusiasm. The systematic analysis of capitalism as a system of alienation, the demonstration that economic structures shape consciousness, the call for revolutionary transformation, all this developed themes Feuerbach had introduced, but Marx had taken them so far beyond anything Feuerbach imagined that they'd become something entirely different. 2 years before his death, he joined the German Social Democratic Party. It was a symbolic gesture, more than political commitment. He was too ill, too isolated, too detached from practical politics to be an active member. But the act acknowledged something he'd resisted throughout his career. Philosophical critique needed political expression. Understanding alienation required working to overcome it. He died September 13th, 1872, largely forgotten except by those who'd known him in his brief moment of influence. The funeral drew little notice. No major obituaries appeared. The philosophical world had moved on, yet his impact persisted in ways he couldn't have anticipated, not through the specific doctrines he'd advocated, most of which were contested or abandoned, not through the complete system he'd promised, but never delivered, but through the questions he'd forced philosophy to address, the methods he'd developed, the critiques he'd articulated. After Feuerbach, you couldn't simply posit abstract consciousness or spirit as fundamental reality. You had to account for embodiment, for sensuousness, for the material conditions that shape thought. After Feuerbach, religious belief required explanation rather than simple acceptance or rejection. The projection theory, however modified or criticized, remained a reference point for understanding how humans create meaning. After Feuerbach, alienation became a central philosophical concept. The idea that humans create products, institutions, or beliefs that then dominate them, that they become estranged from their own creations. This insight shaped subsequent social theory across multiple traditions. The limitations were real. His materialism remained incomplete, caught between idealism and genuine materialism. His anthropology abstracted from history and social relations. His critique of religion lacked connection to practical transformation. His philosophy of the future never materialized as promised. But limitations don't negate achievements. Feuerbach accomplished what he set out to do in crucial respects. He helped end the domination of Hegelian idealism. He established materialism as a viable philosophical position. He demonstrated that religion could be understood naturalistically, as a human creation rather than divine revelation. He showed how philosophical analysis could illuminate cultural and psychological phenomena. The question of his contemporary relevance divides interpreters. Some argue he's historically important, but philosophically superseded. Others find continuing value in his critiques and methods. The truth probably lies between these extremes. His specific claims about religion have been challenged and refined. The projection theory is more complex than Feuerbach recognized. Religious belief can't be reduced to alienated species essence. Cultural, social, psychological, and neurological factors all contribute to religious experience in ways his framework couldn't capture. His materialism seems dated compared to contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science. The body-mind problem he tried to dissolve through sensualism remains contested. His understanding of consciousness and its material basis was necessarily limited by 19th century science. His political philosophy, such as it was, never developed beyond programmatic statements. The insistence that humanity must become its own object, that politics must replace religion, that human welfare depends on human action. These remain abstractions without concrete institutional or economic analysis. Yet certain themes retain force. The critique of abstraction, the insistence on starting from concrete embodied existence rather than pure concepts. This methodological principle continues to challenge various forms of idealism. The emphasis on feeling, on sensuous experience, on the lived body as the basis of consciousness. These phenomenological themes anticipate later developments. The analysis of how humans create meaning by projecting qualities onto external objects, whether gods or commodities or institutions, remains relevant for understanding ideology and culture. Feuerbach's insight that we worship our own creations without recognizing them as such applies beyond religion to many domains of social life. Most fundamentally, his insistence that philosophy must be anthropology, must take concrete human beings rather than abstract principles as its starting point, established a perspective that shaped subsequent thought. Whether you follow Marx into political economy, Nietzsche into genealogy, Freud into psychoanalysis, or existentialism into phenomenology, you're working within a framework Feuerbach helped create. The man who died largely forgotten in 1872 had planted seeds that would flower in unexpected ways. His specific system failed. His promised philosophy of the future never arrived. But the reorientation he initiated, the questions he posed, the methods he developed, these entered the bloodstream of modern thought and continue circulating there. The transformation wasn't immediate. Ideas don't change the world the moment they're published. They percolate, mutate, find unexpected applications in contexts their authors never imagined. Feuerbach's influence operated through multiple channels, some direct, others so indirect the connection became invisible. The young Hegelians who devoured the essence of Christianity in the 1840s dispersed across Europe, carrying fragments of his critique into journalism, politics, education, scientific materialism. They didn't all become Feuerbachians in any orthodox sense. They extracted what seemed useful and discarded the rest. The scientific materialists of the 1850s and 1860s exemplified this pattern. Carl Vogt, Jakob Mohlschott, Ludwig Büchner, these popularizers built movements that reduced everything to matter and force. "You are what you eat" became their slogan, lifted directly from Feuerbach's Heidelberg lectures. But they stripped away the philosophical sophistication, the nuanced understanding of consciousness and culture, leaving crude materialism that Feuerbach himself might have rejected. Yet this vulgarization served a purpose. In an era when religion still dominated education and public discourse, scientific materialism offered an alternative worldview accessible to ordinary people. The working class didn't need to understand Hegel's dialectic to grasp that foodstuffs become blood, blood becomes brain, brain produces thought. The simplification that philosophers deplored made the ideas politically effective. Nietzsche read Feuerbach carefully, though he rarely acknowledged the debt, the critique of Christianity as life-denying, the analysis of how humans project their highest values onto imaginary beings, the genealogical approach to understanding how beliefs emerge from psychological needs. All this appears in Feuerbach first. Nietzsche radicalized the critique, pushed it further into nihilism and affirmation, but the foundation was there. Freud's debt is equally unacknowledged, but arguably deeper. The entire psychoanalytic project rests on the premise that consciousness creates illusions to satisfy unconscious wishes. God as wish fulfillment, religion as collective neurosis. These Freudian insights have Feuerbachian roots. The mechanism differs, unconscious drives replacing species essence, but the fundamental operation is identical. We create fantasies that answer our needs, then mistake these creations for objective reality. The phenomenological tradition found different resources in Feuerbach. Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on embodied consciousness, on perception as fundamentally corporeal rather than purely intellectual, echoes Feuerbach's sensualism. The lived body as the site where meaning emerges, where spirit and matter unite, this became central to 20th century phenomenology. Feuerbach had insisted on this against Hegel's abstraction 70 years earlier. Existentialism's concern with finitude, death, anxiety, these themes saturate Feuerbach's later writings. The confrontation with nature as overpowering force, the recognition of human dependence and vulnerability, the search for meaning within finite existence rather than infinite transcendence, all this anticipated existentialist preoccupations. Feuerbach lacked their dramatic intensity, their literary brilliance, but he'd mapped the terrain they would explore. The irony is that Feuerbach's influence grew as his name faded. By 1900, few philosophers read him directly, but his ideas had been absorbed by Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and through them entered the intellectual mainstream. The critique of religion as projection, the materialist understanding of consciousness, the anthropological approach to philosophy, these became common property, their origin forgotten. This pattern of influence without attribution isn't unusual. Most revolutionary thinkers are forgotten once their revolution succeeds, their insights becoming so obvious that nobody remembers they were once radical. Feuerbach suffered this fate more thoroughly than most. The 20th century brought periodic rediscoveries. Each generation found something different. The 1920s emphasized his materialism. The 1960s recovered his humanism. Recent scholarship has focused on his theory of embodiment and intersubjectivity. Each reading highlights different aspects, proving the work's richness while also demonstrating its fundamental incompleteness, because the promised philosophy of the future never arrived. Feuerbach offered programmatic statements, provocative theses, brilliant critiques. He dismantled idealism and theology with devastating effectiveness. But the positive reconstruction remained fragmentary, suggestive rather than systematic. The principles of the philosophy of the future reads like notes for a book he never wrote. Aphoristic, elliptical, jumping from topic to topic without full development. You can see where he's heading, the outlines of a materialist anthropology grounded in sensuousness and intersubjectivity, but it never coheres into a complete system. This failure wasn't accidental. Feuerbach had learned from Hegel's example. The systematic ambition, the drive to explain everything within a single conceptual framework. This was precisely what needed to be overcome. Philosophy of the future would be anti-systematic, starting from concrete existence rather than abstract principles. But anti-systematic philosophy faces its own challenges. How do you develop ideas rigorously without system? How do you move from critique to construction while rejecting the architectonic impulse? Feuerbach never solved this problem. His later works circle the same themes without advancing beyond his breakthrough insights of the early 1840s. The personal tragedy compounds the philosophical one. The man who helped inaugurate the modern critique of religion and idealism spent his final years in poverty and obscurity. The factory bankruptcy in 1860 destroyed his financial security. At 56, he found himself dependent on donations from admirers, living in modest circumstances near Nuremberg. His health deteriorated. Chronic illnesses made sustained work difficult. The intellectual world had moved on. Hegelianism was dead, killed partly by Feuerbach's own critique. But the new movements, Marxism, positivism, neo-Kantianism, developed without much reference to him. He'd served his historical purpose and been discarded. The late embrace of socialism suggested awareness of this marginalization. Reading Marx's Capital in 1868, joining the Social Democratic Party in 1870, these gestures acknowledged that philosophical critique alone couldn't transform society. The revolution Feuerbach had imagined, where humanity would recognize itself in its projections and reclaim its alienated powers, required political organization and economic transformation. But this recognition came too late for Feuerbach to contribute meaningfully. He died in 1872, 2 years after joining the party, having attended no meetings, written no political tracts. The symbolic gesture remained symbolic. His funeral was modest. Few attended. The newspapers noted his passing briefly, identifying him as a materialist philosopher who'd opposed Christianity, that he'd helped shape the intellectual framework within which modern secularism developed, that his critique of religion and idealism had influenced virtually every major thinker of the latter 19th century. This went unmentioned. Within a generation, he was remembered primarily as Marx's predecessor. The theses on Feuerbach, with their dismissive criticism, defined how Marxists understood him. Contemplative materialism, abstract anthropology, failure to grasp the importance of praxis, these charges became the standard interpretation. The assessment wasn't entirely unfair. Feuerbach's materialism was contemplative in crucial respects. He analysed how consciousness relates to being without examining how consciousness transforms being through activity. His anthropology abstracted from history and social relations, treating human nature as a philosophical category rather than a product of concrete conditions. Yet the Marxist critique missed what remained valuable: the phenomenological dimensions of Feuerbach's thought, his emphasis on feeling and embodiment, his analysis of how meaning emerges through intersubjectivity. These contributions couldn't be reduced to deficient materialism. They pointed toward problems and possibilities that historical materialism never adequately addressed. The revival of interest in Feuerbach during the late 20th century reflected this recognition. Scholars working in phenomenology, critical theory, and philosophy of religion found resources in his work that Marxist interpretation had obscured. The analysis of projection, the critique of abstraction, the insistence on starting from concrete sensuous existence, these themes spoke to contemporary concerns. The projection theory, in particular, proved surprisingly resilient. Despite its limitations, the basic insight that humans create cultural objects, religious or otherwise, that then appear to possess independent power over their creators, this remains relevant for understanding ideology, commodity fetishism, technological determination. We're still creating things that dominate us, still alienated from our own productions. Feuerbach's specific explanation, projection of species essence, seems dated. Contemporary psychology and anthropology offer more sophisticated accounts of religious belief. But the fundamental pattern he identified, the dialectic of creation and estrangement, continues operating across multiple domains. His critique of abstraction speaks to ongoing philosophical debates. The tendency to mistake concepts for realities, to treat human products as if they possessed existence independent of their creators, this error appears in many forms. Whenever philosophy becomes detached from concrete existence, whenever thinking loses touch with the sensuous world, it supposedly explains, Feuerbach's objection retains force. The emphasis on embodiment anticipated directions philosophy would take a century later. After decades of linguistic and analytical approaches that treated consciousness as primarily conceptual, phenomenology and cognitive science rediscovered the body. Perception, emotion, meaning, all these emerge from embodied engagement with the world. Feuerbach said this in the 1840s against Hegel's pure spirit. His understanding of intersubjectivity, though underdeveloped, pointed toward insights later phenomenology would elaborate. The I-thou relation, the recognition that consciousness is fundamentally social rather than solitary, that self-awareness emerges through relation to others, these themes appear in Feuerbach's later writings. Martin Buber and others would develop them more fully, but the foundation existed. The question remains whether these scattered insights justify Feuerbach's place in the philosophical canon. His major work appeared in 1841. He lived another 31 years without producing anything comparably influential. The promised new philosophy never materialized. The critique of religion, however brilliant, addressed problems increasingly irrelevant to secular societies. Yet the judgments of canonical status often miss what matters. Feuerbach's importance lies less in his systematic achievement than in his transitional role. He helped end one era of philosophy and create conditions for another. Classical German idealism, the tradition running from Kant through Hegel, reached its terminus in Feuerbach's critique. What came after, whether Marx's historical materialism, Nietzsche's genealogy, or phenomenology's return to experience, all define themselves partly through engagement with problems Feuerbach identified. The man who died in obscurity in 1872 had helped remake philosophy's fundamental orientation. Instead of beginning with abstract principles, with pure reason or absolute spirit, philosophy would start from concrete human existence. Instead of treating consciousness as primarily conceptual, it would recognize the role of feeling, embodiment, social relations. Instead of accepting religious and metaphysical claims at face value, it would investigate their origins in human needs and activities. None of these moves originated solely with Feuerbach, but he articulated them with clarity and force at a crucial historical moment. The effect was catalytic, enabling transformations he couldn't have predicted and wouldn't necessarily have endorsed. That's often how intellectual influence works. The revolutionary becomes conservative, the innovator gets superseded, but the questions posed and methods developed continue generating new thinking. Feuerbach's specific answers matter less than the reorientation he initiated, the problems he made visible, the assumptions he taught us to question. His insistence that philosophy must be anthropology, must take humanity rather than God or spirit as its subject, established a framework still operating today. Whether you're doing cognitive science or cultural studies, phenomenology or political economy, you're working within parameters Feuerbach helped establish. The concrete human being, embedded in nature and society, conscious and corporeal, needing and creating, this became philosophy's proper subject. The promise of a philosophy of the future remained unfulfilled in Feuerbach's own work. But the future came anyway, shaped by questions he'd raised and directions he'd indicated. The scattered insights, the fragmentary analyses, the incomplete projects, these mattered more than any finished system could have. They left space for others to develop, to diverge, to discover possibilities Feuerbach himself never imagined. That's the strange fate of transitional figures. They're remembered for what they enabled rather than what they achieved. Feuerbach enabled the modern critique of religion and idealism. He enabled materialist philosophy to emerge as a serious alternative to idealism. He enabled questions about consciousness, embodiment, and social existence that philosophy continues pursuing. The man himself, with his rural isolation and personal disappointments, his unfinished projects and declining influence, fades into history.